All right. So if y'all remember, before the weekend, what we did was we spent a lot of time sort of doing a Docker intro, and then we Dockerized part of a full stack app. We made a Docker image and container for our Django backend API and for Postgres. But our app at that point didn't have any front end code at all, right? And just to refresh ourselves, I'm going to do this from the GitHub UI, but let's take a look at this Docker compose file. And is this font size okay for everyone?
Yeah,
I'll make it like
that,
just how's that?
yeah, that's good.
Okay, perfect. Um, so there we go. Let's just do a quick kind of like review of what we built here. Someone can someone remind me like, and this is a YAML file, YML, which is just another one of these text-based formats that gets used a lot for DevOps and configuration stuff like Docker. Can someone remind me like what is this services thingy here? And then why do we have under services API and then DB? Not a trick question. Not looking for a super precise explanation here. Just like if I was explaining it to a Docker newbie, how would we explain it?
Services would be equivalent to your containers, and the API DB are your containers.
Yeah, James, exactly. And thank you. Yeah, Docker API is a Docker container for our Django API backend. DB is for a Postgres database. Here we see for API, we're going to build a Docker image using the Docker file living in this directory. For a Postgres database, we're just going to use the official Postgres Docker image that gets pulled down from Docker Hub. And then in the Docker Compose file, there's this services here because Docker Compose lets us have containers communicate. It sort of sets up a network for them and also controls how they interact. And the key bit being here, this depends on, right? And someone just remind me what depends on is doing here.
We're waiting for the database to be up and running.
Yeah, exactly. And James, as long as you're at it, what is for this database here? Why do we say volumes and what is that doing? What's a volume and why do we want to give the database one?
To persist data, to save the data when we close out or stop the container from running.
Yeah, exactly. And where does that persisted data live, more or less?
In that, right there where you're pointing it, and at that location there, the Postgres slash data, the var lib Postgres equals slash data at that tab.
Yeah. And that question, I realized as soon as I said it was, I didn't mean it to be a bit of a trick question, but I didn't have an answer in mind. You're totally right. Inside the container, the data lives here in this directory slash var slash lib slash postgres slash data. Outside the container in our host operating system, I don't know where on like my laptop's file system this happens, but the data lives on my host operating system on my laptop, right? If we're running this off of my laptop and Docker gives that space a name. And that's why I realized the question was a little bit of a trick question. Um, and someone else want to remind me, like, what's the story here with environment under our Django API? And we have like all these settings here, and then I see this dollar sign here. What are these doing? Jacob.
Uh, Steve on this, but I'm guessing it's saying like the actual requirements for the environment is like being set to uh, all the stuff that's actually in the database. Like the port is being set to the actual database port. I don't know. That's what I'm gonna say.
Well, and what environment is sort of short for something here? Like what is in what are we creating?
Oh, is it an image?
Well, we're creating an image, but for environment specifically,
Environment variables.
yeah, exactly, James. Thank you. And in fact, let me hop over. It's probably time to go to VS Code because I can do splits way better there. Um, man, I swear the VS Code UI is killing me right now. Um, there we go. So if we pop open our Docker compose dev file and let's close this stuff out, we do a little split, and then we open up let's run compose dev. So Jacob, over here in this shell script, we create these different shell environment variables, and
Oh,
these should
yeah.
look familiar, right?
Yeah.
Where in our code do these get used?
It's usually in like
Yeah,
um, settings file.
yeah, exactly, exactly. In settings PY for Django. And so we defined them here in the shell script, and we talked about a somewhat better way of not exposing the secret key last time. And then we here in the Docker compose file, we set the environment variable and grab what's from the shell script, right? And we pass these get used inside the Docker container. So inside the Docker container, and when we're building the image for our Docker file, like here on the back end, right? We don't see the environment variables get used here, but what happens is Django gets installed, all these environment variables essentially get imported into the image. So when we run our Django server, and in this Django code, remember in settings PY, we're grabbing all these things not from a .env file, but from environment variables in the shell environment. It will use these values. All right, so that's just a bit of a warm up and sort of review. Let's go ahead now and add the front end. And there's going to be a couple steps here. The first step is just going to be getting the front end code working with the back end, and then we're going to Dockerize it. So I went ahead and I added front end code. So right now we have a backend directory and a front end directory. If I go in here, we see a package.json, we see app.jsx. I'm going to go ahead, in fact, and run this. I think I might have had my containers running before. Yep. And in fact, it seems to say that none of these are set for some reason. And let's go ahead and start and run that shell script to create our database container and our API. And while it's doing that, I'll open up Thunder Client and we can just make a request to test that this is working once this is done. And it looks like, there we go. We're getting our list of wines back from the Django API, right? And if I type Docker space PS, I see the two Docker containers running. I see the port mapping where our Django API is exposed on port 8000. So I want my front end app to talk to port 8000. Um, no sweat. I'm going to go into the front end directory. And everyone feel relatively comfortable with this code base. It's pretty straightforward. The routing is here. It's using component style. And we've got two really simple components to add a wine to our database. And it's just a form that makes an API call with fetch. This doesn't even use Axios. And to get wines from the database. And here we have a use effect that fires off when this component page loads. And it gets all the wines and it sets them. And then we see like there's this create wine list function that just uses a map to make a bunch of H2s with wine information. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm in my front end directory. I'm going to go ahead and just install whatever the package.json dependencies are. And let's just do what we've always done and do npm run dev. And so far, so good. This is looking great. Let me bring a browser into, and maybe we'll put this here for the moment, and we'll put this there. And I'm going to go ahead and open up my favorite tab, the network tab, and we'll go to localhost 5173. So far, so good. Now I run into a problem. I try to list my wines, but it fails. And I get a CORS error. I see the request. It seems to be going to the right spot. HTTP localhost 8000 API. But I'm getting this, if we look at the response field to load response data, that's not very useful, but the status is useful where it says CORS error. Anyway, and what's like the class, like we've all encountered this. Anyone remember like one way to resolve this issue? CORS, I think, is one of the trickier things. Anyone want to talk about what CORS is?
It allows you to hook up your backend to the front end. So that's dealt with in settings.py, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. And Owen, what does CORS stand for? What's the acronym? What does the acronym stand for?
You lost me there.
Yeah, no worries. It stands for cross origin resource sharing, right? Cross origin resource sharing. And like I said, I always get confused by this. But if you'll think about it, you know, what happens is um let's call it npm run dev server. And actually we'll put that up here. And then let's have one more box. And this is going to be the browser. So let's talk real quickly about the flow, right, of HTTP requests. When I go to localhost 5173, this is what happens, right? The first thing that loads is index.html, right? If I go back to here and I do a hard refresh, the first thing the browser requests, not from our Django API server, but from our v dev server, right? Because that's what has this, is index.html. And then when the browser loads index.html, this is a bunch of fancy stuff that the vdev server does for us. But in essence, these script elements say, hey, make more GET requests to get a JavaScript file, to get a CSS file, to get an image file. And so we have one origin. The origin for our React app is our dev server over here on HTTP localhost 5173. Then when inside the app, and let's just put this, I'll put like a 1 to show that this is the first thing that happens. When the user clicks on, list all wines, and so then this is 2. We make a GET request to, get localhost 8000 API E1 wines. And our Django API is, while they're both running on the same IP address, our local host of it's like 127.0.0.1. They're running on different ports, which means that our Django API is receiving a request from another origin, right? Because our Django API knows what port it's running on. It knows itself. And part of what the browser does when it sends an HTTP request is pass along the information of, of where the request is coming from. I think it's maybe in where the initial HTML page is loaded. And so the Django API knows that the HTML page that the browser loaded that this request is coming from is not from localhost 8000, it's from some other origin, right? So this is what makes a cross-origin request. And I realize I did a little bit of hand waving here, but I just want to check in and see if that makes sense to folks. Yes, no, maybe. I see a thumbs up. Cool. I have to like continually refresh myself on this all the time. And again, honestly here, I think the MDN articles is the one to go. And as it says here, CORS is an HTTP-based header mechanism that allows a server to indicate an origin, right? A domain or a host name or port other than its own from which a browser should allow loading resources. Right? And CORS matters for security reasons, in essence. Because, if I load the Citibank website, but there's some malicious JavaScript on there and it's sending requests somewhere else, or, some other JavaScript from somewhere else is trying to interact with the Citibank website, that's potentially a security issue. And I realize I'm doing a little bit of hand waving. And it's, as I said, I always find this a little confusing. So I always kind of have to go back and look at the docs again. But this is the essence of it, is a request coming from another origin is a cross-origin request. And I think all this happens sort of at the browser and the HTTP header level. In that, again, when this index.html is loaded here, I think that the browser saves that somewhere, and in fact, if we go and we look at the headers, let's clear this and look at when we go to list wines. And let's see. There it is. Here in the request headers that gets sent when we request the wines. Can you all see this? The origin is sent and it's localhost 5173, right? And the browser sends the origin in the headers of every single HTTP request it sends. So this is behavior that's baked into the browser. And so that's how Django knows, hey, this request is coming from another origin. And right now, Django doesn't allow that. You guys have ran into this as a pain point, but when we deploy to a production environment and instead of, the Vite dev server, we're using Nginx and it's I don't know, on one server, so maybe it's, I don't know, 192.168. Blah, 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 blah on port. Let's just make one up. And our Django API is running on a different virtual server in the cloud. Then the two different origin things become real, right? And these are the cloud. And this is the user's browser on a different computer. And this is a bit of a design decision. Like the Pokey API that we know and love allows requests from all origins. And if we want an API whose purpose is to receive requests from a bunch of different clients, then that's fine. But if the API is really just for our application, then it's a good security practice to restrict the allowed origins that requests can come from. They should only be coming from our web app. Right? So this becomes more relevant when we get into production deploys. So this was a little bit of a side road, but we're going to come back to this later when we deploy to AWS, and we're probably going to have to do a little bit of messing with environment variables for this when we Dockerize. So I wanted to dig into this a bit just to help us familiarize with this more. Do folks have any questions about cores or anything on your mind before we keep on rolling? Okay, cool. So, and let me point something. Let's see. We'll come back to what's going on here in just a second, actually. I'll explain how we got port 8000 into the front end app to begin with. But let's finish up this cores discussion and let's update our Django app to use cores. So I'm going to go ahead and kill this dev server. I'm going to go ahead and move back into my main project directory and run stop compose dev. Because while there's a couple ways to deal with this, especially because we're going to do this in production, we want to use the Django cores headers package, which I believe is what you all have been using to deal with this with Django, correct? Does this look
Yes.
familiar? Yep. So turns out we don't have this installed. So let's go ahead and add this. And we're going to have to tweak settings py, which probably means a little bit of environment variable and Docker compose tweaking. So I'm just going to go ahead and do pip install Django. I'm not sure what virtual environment I have activated at the moment. So in fact, I think what I'm going to do is, because we need the only thing we really need is this in requirements.txt. I'm just going to Google Django cores headers version. It's going to take me to the same IPy site. I just want the latest version. It's 4.6.0. So let's just add it up here. Django cores headers equals 4.6.0. Right? Because that's the key thing. Because this gets run inside what the Docker container. It gets run when we build the image that we then run inside a container. And now we do have to do a little bit of tweaking of our settings py. For one thing, under installed apps, I have to add cores headers. And then under middleware, I have to add this middleware stuff so that anyone know what middleware is, by the way? We didn't talk about this, so there's no reason that you would. So middleware is code that gets run every time Django receives a request. Like, think of it as a series of tubes in order from top to bottom that an HTTP request goes through before it hits our view code. So by the time our view code is run and that HTTP request object is there, the HTTP request has already passed through security middleware code. Then it goes through session middleware code, which is when, if there's an auth token, the user info is grabbed from the database. Then it goes through cores middleware code, and then some other stuff that I'm not as familiar with. And there's authentication here, which should probably be at the top, but that's probably okay. I think actually we probably just want the cores middleware at the very top, and it is saying cores middleware should be placed as high as possible. I'm just going to double check if it goes after or before. And these search results aren't so useful, but I think this is probably fine. Can anyone confirm, like, is this where you normally put the cores middleware in the middleware list?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, perfect. If we run into an issue, we'll know why. So we've added that there. And now just kind of going through here, we need to configure it. And there's a couple different ways. The main way is this cores allowed origins environment variable, which I'm going to put right by allowed hosts. And I'm going to do the same sort of hack I did before. And I think that should work fine. This is a whitelist. We can also set cores allow all origins, which honestly seems really nice and useful for local development. So let's add that as well. And I believe that this overrides everything else. Now, quick question. What's a good default to put here? Thinking not just about local development, but about deploying to this production in the real world. If I screw up and forget to set this, what's the safest value for this? True or false?
False.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd say
and
false.
why? Say that again.
No, I agree. I was about to say false too.
Yeah, and James, why false?
So you don't allow anybody or any server to access your servers.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. Because this is a little dangerous. Because if I screwed this setting up in a production environment, it could cause problems. in fact, you might see on like maybe we wouldn't even have this at all. That's in fact the safest, though it adds a little extra step. But for us, for local dev, we're gonna do this. And so now we kind of have to do the dance of opening up our Docker Compose. And we have to, I know I'm going to get these names wrong, so I'm just going to copy and paste them in. And we'll just put them here. And I'm going to delete all that stuff. And we're going to grab these from the environment variables, which means we'll have to update our shell script as well. I'm going to make sure I got my spelling right here because I screwed that up with one of them the last time. And so that's looking good. And now if I go to the shell script, we're going to, let's add them here under networking config. And because this is local development, we're going to set this to true. We might as well give this a value just to give it a value. But so now, in theory, we should have our Django app configured to work for all origins. And when we deploy this to production, all we need is a different shell script that sets different values here, but we can use everything else. So let me go ahead and run compose dev, build our images again with these new environment variables. And it looks like I made a mistake. It looks like I have a typo in requirements.txt. I used 1 equals. It looks like maybe I need 2. Let's see what it is. And indeed, that was me just jumping the gun. Let's try fixing that. So again, sometimes the error messages aren't friendly, but sometimes they are. So it always pays to just take that time to really read them through. And let's see. The user requested Django 416. Django cores headers depends on Django 4.2. Welcome to the world of software engineering. Let's see if that solves the problem. Probably way behind and can update Django. It's amazing how many version things pop up, which is why software breaks over time. Like one library depends on another, and then that library breaks, and you have a chain of like 5 of these things. Let's see, module not found, course headers, Django. So this tells me I probably made a mistake here in installed apps. And I forgot to add a comma. Right. And this is a good example too of, I've read a lot of error messages, so I can move through these relatively quickly. But really, the way to test this is not by building the Docker images, it's by running the code outside Docker because it's easier to debug and fix this way. Let me make sure these are stopped. But it's a good example too of why for local dev, like unless you really are getting value added from the Docker containers, you may not need them. And now we've got cores allow origin should be a bool, origin star is missing scheme or blah, 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 blah. Add a scheme, HTTP, blah, 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 blah. So it looks like there's two issues here. One is I need to add, I think, HTTP before this star. And the other is that this needs to be a Boolean and not a string. So what we can do is if we go to our shell script, I think this will solve that issue, but I'm honestly not sure. We'll see. And then here we need to convert this into a Boolean. And I'm going to use the same pattern that is from here from debug. So true if os.get env cores allow all origins equals true, else false. And this stuff might seem a little mundane, but these are exactly the kind of real world issues you run into when Dockerizing stuff, including when we add in Nginx. So kind of seeing these and getting a preview of these is actually the valuable part because these are the sticking points, right? Once you have the basic concept down and you kind of have a guideline to follow, inevitably these kinds of issues will come up. So it's good to see how to be able to resolve them. And it looks like they started, but I want to stop and restart them just to be safe. I want to make sure they get built again. And I think we're doing okay here because they seem to be working out. So I'll pull up a Thunder client and let's test it again. I seem to be able to make an HTTP request with success. And let's go to my front end. Let's run our dev server. We have no need to change anything in our front end code. Let's hop over to localhost 5173, and now we have wines, right? So now we've set up cross-origin resource sharing, and we've set it up in such a way that when we're ready to deploy to production on AWS or whatever, we can use the setup that we already have, and we just have to change some environment variable settings. This is probably a good pausing point. After this, I want to very briefly show a little bit of how React knows to talk to port 8000 at all. And then we will actually build the Docker file for our front end and Nginx. I think we should be able to wrap up by 10:30, but I'm thinking we should take maybe like a 5-minute break. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, awesome. And before we break, do folks have any questions, like something that might be good to go over with what we've been doing with adding cores to Django and then updating our Docker Compose? Okay, awesome. So let's take 5 and just to kind of give everyone something to put in your heads for the next 5 minutes. This line right here, import.meta.env, is how we tell Vite to grab a shell environment variable and inject it into our JavaScript code when it builds it before it gets sent to the server. So this is the key link, and this is the environment variable we'll need to set to make sure our front end knows where to go to talk to our backend. So let's take 5 and then we'll dig into that and start building our front end Docker container. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. All right. So we have successfully connected React, which is running outside of the Docker container, to our running Docker container. Because right now, Man, I lost the other diagram, but if this is Docker, we have database and we have the Django API. And this is all, let me give it just a big containing box here that, and this is my laptop. But right now, the V dev server that is hosting our React app is running outside of Docker, which is fine for now. But we've got them talking to each other, right? And so the next step is to Dockerize this. So this also becomes a Docker container. And instead of the vdev server, we're going to use the Nginx web server that we saw a couple weeks or a couple days ago. And just as a sort of a reminder, Nginx is a web server for hosting HTML files, JavaScript files, CSS files. We can do volume mapping just like we did before. We'll have to do a little bit of port mapping. And we have to build our React app, right? So like our end goal here is sorry, let me pull this down just a bit. Right now I'm in the front end directory. I want to run npm run build. And that builds a version of our JavaScript app for production inside this directory creates called dist that has its own index.html file, whatever image assets, and then all of the JavaScript, including React and all our dependencies, minified and not very human friendly, and all of our CSS. And we want to stick this inside a Docker container running Nginx. And Nginx is going to be the web server to host these three files, index.html, which will then grab all the JavaScript needed for our app and all of the CSS. And I just want to check in to see if that makes sense to folks and if folks have any questions. So before the break, I kind of gave people a little preview. I opened up one of these components, list wines, and I pointed out here this import.meta.env.vbase.url. And now when Chad wrote this app, he was doing it quick and dirty. He didn't even use Axios. He's just using fetch to make the HTTP requests. So, with Axios, this might go in our, API.js or utils.js, and we have that nice API object that we export. So I can use my configured Axios everywhere I want. Because in fact, if I go over here to create wine, I see, he did not follow the don't repeat yourself principle. He just copied it here as well. Let's see what this import.meta.env is. And it's a combination of two things. Import.meta is actually a JavaScript thing. It's a special way to sort of import metadata. You're not meant to use it for like normal imports. It's meant for stuff like this. And what Vite does for us is it looks for shell environment variables whenever I run npm run dev or npm run build. and it grabs them and inserts them into the JavaScript build, or it actually inserts this into the JavaScript code. So this lets us access different environment variables. And one of these is, I guess Veet calls it mode, which is development versus production, or staging. So that might be a good one to add later. But we're going to focus right now just on base URL, right? And this is the base URL the app is being served from. And this is set by a configuration option. We can set this, maybe can set it in vconfig. But the easiest way to do this is by setting the environment variable. And we do have the prod, the production environment variable, and dev, which we haven't talked about a ton. But for production versus development environments, like it basically affects sort of debugging stuff. So we can add these as well. That might be useful. Let's go ahead and just see these in action real quick. So what I actually did before the class, and by the way, with Veet and environment variables, I believe they all have to start with Veet underscore. You can also use .env to load them through environment .env files. But yeah, when we're using Veet as our build tool, all of these different environment variables in our React code need to start with Veet underscore to make sure that Veet doesn't grab environment variables we don't want. Veet will only look for environment variables that start with Veet underscore. So what I had actually done earlier before this lesson started was I set the Veet base URL setting. Now, if I kill this shell and open up a new one, this environment variable is not set. If I go into the front end directory and I run npm run dev, and we spin up our local dev and we hop back here and we go to port 5173 and we try to list the wines, it's not working. If I open up the network tab to help me debug, and I don't need all that stuff, I just need this. Let's do create wine because I can fill some stuff out and we can watch it happen. So first of all, I'm curious if there's a console. So we see there's errors in the console log, but the network, these I find useful. If we look at this, the request is going to http/undefined/API. And if we look at these errors, failed to fetch, line 42. And if we look at the code, inevitably that's going to be, well, fetch is called here on line 42, but without that Veet base URL, this is a malformed URL. This is a bad value, right? There was nothing in here. Does that make sense to folks? But if I set that environment variable, and in this case, it's the host name and port that my Django API is running on, and now I run the dev server again. Let's do a refresh and let's just add a wine. Now we're good to go, right? So when I run npm run dev, Veet looks for environment variables that start with Veet underscore and injects them into our code. And it'll do the same thing when we run npm run build. So we know that at some point we're going to have to do that. And in fact, we can go ahead and we might as well add that to a run compose dev script. Now let's front end in vvars. And I'm just gonna hard code this for the moment. And I'll make a note. Actually, I suppose, do we set the Django port? Well, we set the ports here. So if we wanted to, we could even maybe have this set off of an environment variable, but we can kind of worry about that later. I think just having this hard coded for now is a good start. So I'll just add a note here. As to match port API is exposed on in Docker Compose. Host name also has match. That matters more to point to AWS. We'll have to actually know the IP address and the host name or have a way to grab it. So let's go ahead and export that. And to do export dev prod. We're not going to worry too much about those env vars right now. But let's go ahead and actually start building our Nginx Docker file, because that's where a lot of the magic is going to happen. And I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions. Okay, cool. So right now we've got a backend directory, a front end directory. We're going to make a web server directory. And we're going to go in there. And we're actually going to do a couple things here. We're going to make the Docker file for Nginx. And we need to create an Nginx config file to tell the Nginx web server what to do. I'm not going to go too much into detail on this in the interests of time. Nginx configs are actually relatively straightforward. They just look a little different than what we are used to. So I'm just going to code this up and then very briefly talk through it and move on, if that's okay with folks. So Nginx configs are composed of what we call blocks, where this is sort of a Nginx statement or command, and this is a name we come up with, and then everything inside the curly brackets is the block. And we're essentially sort of mapping incoming requests to be sent to port 8000, because what we're going to do now is create a server block. We're going to tell it to listen on port 80. So we're mapping port 8000 that gets exposed on our Docker container onto the server API to port 80, I believe. I'm a little rusty on this stuff myself. I kind of look it up when I need to. Location, think URL. We're not going to use this, but if we were using Django admin, because that has a different URL, we might want to pass that into our Django API as well. But I'm not even going to worry about this right now. And the reason this matters is because certain requests, everything is going to go through Nginx. Now that Nginx is in here, the setup we're actually going to have, let me just go ahead and copy all of this. And let me zoom out just a touch. The setup we're actually going to end up with is going to look something like this. Everything is going to go through Nginx. And so our Nginx web server needs to be able to do a couple things. It needs to know to do a couple things. It needs to know pass API calls onto the Django API. It needs to know where to get index.html, app.jss, app.css, and so on. They live in the Nginx container, and it needs to know the difference between a Django API call and a request for index.html or other static files. So this is what we're configuring right now in this config file. And what we're saying here is Nginx, here's where you go to find index.html. And this is just comes from how Nginx is configured inside the container, and it's from the Nginx Docker image docs. And we're saying Nginx, when we're asking you to find, cats.jpg or myawesomecomponent.css, use the URL path that you're given, but if all else fails, default and grab index.html and send that. And so HTTP requests where the URL has API in them, Nginx will send on to our Django API. Ones that don't have API in the URL, Nginx will grab a file from its file system and serve that. So that's what we're configuring here. And I realize that this config file format is a bit new, so I don't want to go too deep into it, but I just want to pause and check in if that sort of big picture goal makes sense to people. Yes, no, maybe, sort of. Awesome. Thank you, Sean. Yeah, and this is useful because this configuration of having everything pass through a web server is really common. It's good for security reasons. If we needed to make a load balancer, which some of you have probably maybe started to learn about with that AWS course, right? We could configure Nginx as some sort of load balancer if we wanted to handle like traffic loads. So, if you're a front end dev, you might not be doing a ton of this, though I actually had to fix some Nginx config stuff as a front end dev once because a front end feature was broken because the URLs were wrong. And that had to do with an Nginx config somewhere. So you never know. It's not critical. It's for our purposes for Docker, this is a more of we just need to get this working and you can copy this to get to our end goal here for the Docker file. So we've set up our Nginx config. Let's actually set up our Docker file with
Is
that.
there any reason? Oh, can you go
Oh,
back to
yes.
that
What's up, James?
default config file?
Oh, then say that again.
Is there any particular reason why on line 18 you got try files URI twice?
I would have to check, to be honest. If we go to like the Nginx docs, each of those is a command that has, and where is it? The docs are a little hard to read, but they're not too bad. Um, I am pretty, I wonder if this is, yeah, I don't think it's a typo. I'm pretty darn sure what this is you know how sometimes like in the browser, if I have a URL, sometimes like if we make a mistake, we might put a slash at the end of it, or maybe the link does or something like that. Well, technically these are two different things, but if we're searching for a file, and so for example, let's pretend this was the URI stands for Universal Resource Image. It's very similar to URL, Universal Resource Locator. I forget what the I stands for. But if this was cats.jpg and for whatever reason somehow we had a slash here, we wouldn't want like this to fail and break. So this handles both of those scenarios where there is a trailing slash and not a trailing slash. And try
Gotcha. Thank you.
files, yeah, great question. It just goes left to right. It tries this first. If it doesn't work, it tries this, and then the fallback is grab index.html. Um, actually, and as to your point too, like we could have different configurations in here. Like instead of default.conf, we could also have maybe production.conf and staging.conf. And it's actually really easy with one or two commands to reload Nginx using a different configuration. And default.conf is the default configuration by default with Nginx. Yeah, great question. This is it's a little bit of, I think follow examples and copy and paste is how we built this, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on with those three things. Yeah, great question. What else is on people's minds actually about Nginx before I move on? Okay, let's build our Docker file. So we're going to build our Docker file in two steps. One, build the production React app, take that build, and then we stick it in the Nginx Docker image and get rid of stuff we no longer need, like Node.js, the source directory, node modules, right? Because once we run npm run build, we have inside that dist directory our whole React application. And that's all we need. And for a production environment, this stuff just takes up extra space. And especially with Node.js, maybe something accidentally breaks. So we have our base image. It's going to be a Node.js image. And we'll just do Node.js likes to name their versions, I guess, like Alpine and other things. LTS stands for long-term support. We're going to tell Docker, hey, we're going to throw away this image after a while. The working directory, we're going to name front end. And we have to set env vars when we build the image. And when we run the container, I think. To be honest, I'm a little unclear on this point, but here we're setting the Veep base URL. Actually, we don't need to set it here because we do it in the shell script. So we should just be able to do this. I'm actually not even sure if I need to do this with this in the shell script, but we'll put this here. We'll come back to that because I think with the Docker compose, we may not need to do that. We're going to copy from the front end directory in our code into the container package.json. And we're going to copy it into the current working directory. We're going to run npm install. We're going to copy all of our source code. That's inside this front end directory that now has node modules, public source. It won't have dist. And in fact, let me go ahead and delete the dist directory. Oh, and I put the web server in the wrong spot. There we go. Now web server is where we want it. Let me go ahead and just reopen these files again before I forget. And now that we've copied all of our source code, node modules, public and source, from the front end directory into our working directory, we're going to run npm run build. And now those are the steps we needed to build our production front end. And let me go ahead and let me add a little bit to the Docker file to make sure I'm not losing track of stuff. And I think what I'm going to do is just right here below the API, let's add the Nginx Docker container. And we are going to build it from a Docker file. I'm honestly not 100% certain what context does, but I believe it maybe says what directory to initiate this process from, because unlike with the Django one, we're not running this. Our Docker file for Nginx is living somewhere other than all of our front end code. So I think what we're doing is we're saying, hey, let's run all this from the Docker file directory, or excuse me, run all this from the root directory where the Docker compose file is. Because the next thing we do is we say, hey, our Docker file is in web server / Docker file. As long as I'm doing this, we're also going to tell Nginx to always restart. We're going to set up our port mapping now, as long as we're doing it. And let's set up some environment variables. And this is where we're going to do Veep base URL equals Veep base URL. And I think this will do what we need. If I'm wrong, there might be like a particular wrinkle I'm missing. The code I'm using as a guide does a bit of extra work in manually setting it here. So if we run into a problem, we'll know that we'll need to add that back. But I think this should be okay. So we have in our shell script, we set the Veep base URL. We run the Docker compose. In the Docker compose, we've now added this Nginx service where we're saying, all right, we're going to build this using the Docker file in the web server directory, but execute the build from the project root directory because we need to grab stuff from front end as well. And so then this Docker file gets built. It works off of Node.js. We grab our package JSON from our front end code and install it to get the node modules. We grab the source code. Then we run npm run build. And now our work building the JavaScript app is done. And we can throw away everything except the dist directory that npm run build created. So we actually have another base image. And this is unique to the builder pattern. And this is where we bring in the Nginx web server. And we have to copy a couple things. We have to copy the configuration for the web server and put it where Nginx expects it to live. And again, this path just comes from the Nginx docs and the Nginx Docker container docs. And we have to tell Docker, hey, go to that builder image and copy the dist directory that has our React app and put it here where Nginx will look to serve HTML files. And then Docker at the end of the day keeps this, but once all this stuff is done, gets rid of that so that our Nginx Docker image is really lean and mean. And all it has is Nginx and the code in dist. Node.js is not installed, neither is node modules or anything like that. So this is a bit fancy, but this is also a good pattern that you'll see, and it's useful for production environments. And so now, fingers crossed, we can go ahead and run let me go ahead and stop everything. And let's go ahead and run everything. And here we see the Nginx builder pattern in action. npm install is probably taking a while. Stuff is being copied. Fingers crossed I got the environment variable stuff right. And now we have 3 containers instead of 2, where we have an API one. And as soon as this is done, I can type docker ps. We can see our 3 containers running. So the Django API is exposed on port 8000, but now this Nginx container should be running our app. It should have a port exposed. I wonder if I got something wrong there. Let's just try it out and see if it works. I should just be able to go to localhost, which gives me port 80. And that doesn't seem to work. So I wonder what went wrong here. Because we do set the ports here and we map 80 to 80, and that's kind of what I have in my notes. I wonder if I screwed something up with the environment variables. It seems unlikely, but it's not impossible. Because Docker can get a little tricky. So let's just try doing this the other way, the sort of hard-coded way, and see if that works. I wouldn't have expected that to mess with the port stuff, but I could be wrong. And then let's stop this and spin it up one more time and see what happens. So let's see here. And it's taking a minute just to do its thing. And now let's do Docker PS. And I am a little surprised and a little concerned. We don't seem to have Nginx running on port 80. Let's see if we can't debug this. If it's not a quick fix, I may circle back because we got awfully far. I suspect there's something really simple that I'm missing here. So indeed, here it shows the mapping to port 8080. Let's see if this works now. You know what? It may be it may be working just fine, but maybe I forgot that we have to make a request on a different URL now. Um, let's test out a couple of things here. Yeah, so I got something wrong here, folks. I do apologize. I'm not quite sure what, because we got awfully close, but we're not quite there. Um, I may just debug this later. Um, I do apologize because the networking stuff I feel like can get a little tricky. And to be honest, also isn't my strength. So I'm not sure I can effectively debug this on the fly. Because it does appear that this is exposed on port 80. But for some reason, the Nginx container, yeah, let's look at these. Let's look through the logs because the Nginx container might not be running at all. Um, it's also possible, let me check my guide code. I may have forgotten to add a command to start the Nginx container, though I don't think we need to. I think Nginx just kind of will start itself up. let me try one thing and then we'll call it a day. Because if I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at these logs, first off, I'm not seeing any errors. Um, we could always try connecting to the Docker container too. That actually might not be the worst way to do it. Let's see, the name is Docker Compose App Nginx 1. And so I think we can do something like Docker exec dash IT, blah, 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 slash bin slash sh. Container is restarting, wait till the container is running. I see. So the Nginx container is still restarting. And considering how long it's been, it appears that it's continuously restarting. And that makes me think that something did indeed go wrong with the Nginx. Um, let's try doing this a different way, and then if that doesn't work, we'll switch gears. Because I suspect maybe that restart true command is causing us trouble. And I wonder. Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. I do apologize. Let's try it this way, and then if it doesn't work, I'll have to I'll circle back and get this working. But we at least figured out what's going on, which is that the Nginx container is created, but the container seems to be continuously restarting itself. So now if we see if we see that the Nginx container is not continuously restarting, then that's probably progress. And it appears to have started and then stopped. So this at least tells us where the issue is. And in fact, I'm doing a quick Google search of Docker Compose and the container. And that restart command restarts if there's an error or an issue. So I suspect that I may have done something wrong here in setting up the Docker file. So I do apologize. This one may be more than I want to. Oh, in fact, is the mistake I made as simple as no, this appears to have everything that we want.
I don't think localhost should have those quotations on line 13.
You may be right. I don't think that breaks stuff because I've used the quotes for other things, but it certainly can't hurt. And let's try restart unless stopped, because I think the restart is important because I think that also might be the way Nginx works to initialize it. The restart has it actually start for the first time. Let's see what our status is now. Okay, so clearly the issue here is the Nginx container is continuously restarting itself. And I think what that means is there's some sort of error, and that's what's triggering the restarts. So I will probably have to just dig into this. Oh, it looks like, you know what? Actually down here. Okay, I think I found it, folks. I think I screwed up the Nginx config. An expected curly bracket and etc Nginx config default line 19. So let's take a look at our Nginx config. And of course, yep. Let's see if that does it. So I apologize. This may all have come down to a missing semicolon on my end. Let's try this one more time. And so this is a good example of, if you're setting this up, you should just copy and paste the whole friggin' Nginx config in there. Because, if it's for config stuff and stuff like this, if it's not something you know well, the golden rule is like, don't touch anything and leave it exactly as is. And as you can see, even me doing that, I still made a mistake. And that mistake was simply I just forgot a semicolon at the end. The other takeaway here is if we go to extensions, I'm sure, yep, syntax highlighting for Nginx config files, which I did not have installed. So that's the real takeaway here. Because maybe that plugin, that extension isn't running now, but 5 gets you 10. That with this up and running, maybe I would have at least gotten a red squiggly or something telling me that I had a syntax issue here. But let's see if this finally works. And lo and behold, we have our wines and we have our list of wines. James, thank you for the debugging help. Folks, thank you for your patience. We now have our whole application Dockerized, which is awesome. So we have an Nginx web server that takes all requests. It passes on API requests to our Django API container that then talks to the database. And requests that are for index.html or other pages get handled there. And we saw how to build our front-end app inside the Nginx container. So there were a couple of twists and turns, but hopefully some good sort of real-world debugging along the way. This is why log files are so useful. I should have read these more carefully in the beginning, but that's where I saw the issue, because here in the log file, there was an error message. Cool. Thank you, folks. I know this ran a bit long, so I do want to wrap, but I just want to see what questions folks have or what might be good to go over a bit before we wrap up. That might be good to review. How are we feeling on this? Good. So I know we covered a lot of ground. I'm pretty darn sure, by the way, that our setup that we had before, where we don't have to set these and we grab these from the shell script, will work just fine. Um,
Can you upload this to Yankee Demos and Note?
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, all this code is getting uploaded. And in fact, it's already there. I'll upload exactly what we did. There's some minor differences, like the old version of the example hard codes the this environment variable. That was a bit of why I got a little confused. Um, and indeed, that does appear to run into an issue doing it the way that I wanted to originally. So, so I think we actually do have to hard code that environment variable. Um, I'll look into why that's happening, but yeah, because that's not getting set. Um, I would have thought Docker Compose would have passed it in, but maybe there's an extra step I need to do, probably dealing with the builder container. So the first way we saw it is the way to go. Um, and I'll share the link, but so James, and for everyone, the complete build of this is already up here under this Docker Compose app with backend, front end, web server, a README that walks you through it, which now I think will be really useful because you guys are all familiar with this, that talks about the different steps and kind of goes through, like other commands that this is equivalent to. Um, there's a bit more in here because there's actually another version of these shell scripts and compose files for building containers that are meant to be deployed onto AWS. Um, and there's in fact a shell script to create, I think, an EC2 instance on AWS. And once you have an AWS account, to actually push those images up. But that's a bit out of scope. I'll share the code from today on a separate branch, but I really was following this guide, so this is going to be very useful and similar to what we saw as well. Um, and I will drop this in our Slack channel. And I think what I'll do too is I'll add it here to the main README for the whole org so that people can find it. So it'll be there as well. Cool. Thank you very much, folks. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.